If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the scariest thing that happened to you as in Paranormal, Skinwalker, etc. It was late at night, December, full moon. Snow covered the ground and the moonlight reflected off the snow. It almost felt daylight outside. I walked to my garage, separate from the house, to grab a soda. I seen my neighbor was feeding his chickens. He seen me and waved, so I walked over and asked him, "Why are you feeding so late?" He said, "Passed out in my chair. Also, would you mind doing me a favor?" I said, "Sure." He said, "I have a tool of your dad's I was using and I need to return it. It's inside. I will be right back." I stood there for a second and he came back out and handed me a Dremel tool. Few more short words and we said goodnight and parted ways. I set the Dremel on the kitchen counter and go lay down in my room. In the morning my dad came in my room and said, "Hey Monk, what did I say about soda in your room?" I woke up and said sorry and I started getting out of bed. He then said, "Hey, did you set this Dremel on the counter?" I said, "Yes sir." And he said, "Where did you get it?" I said, "John." And he said, "When?" I said, "Last night." He said, "Impossible. John is in Texas for his daughter's Air Force graduation." I said, "I saw him last night feeding his chickens." And he said, "I'm taking care of his animals. He's not gonna be back home till Wednesday, 4 days away." "Did you break into his house and steal it?" he asked. I said, "No way. I didn't even know he was borrowing a tool." So he walked me over to his house, and he wasn't home. The house was locked. We even called John and he said he was in Texas. I still have no explanation of what happened. Not sure if this counts as scary or not, but I'd say it was one of the oddest things to happen to me. When I was a kid I absolutely loved this cartoon called Reboot. Had an action figure of one of the protagonists, Bob. Brought that toy with me wherever I went until I lost it. Every now and then over the years I'd rip through my things thinking I'd find it but never did. When I was about 19 I'd lost my mom and her entire estate went to her husband. Maybe 5 or 6 years after that he decided to sell the house I grew up in. While it was on market or shortly after it was sold I decided to go to the property and say goodbye to the house, so to speak. The house had a good amount of acreage and was secluded, so walking around the property and the outside of what felt like a husk of a house had me some pretty odd vibes. Anyways, I was walking around the side of the house and onto the patio when I noticed something small on the ground. It was my Bob action figure I'd lost around 12 years ago. Just sitting on its ass like it had been waiting. A little paint worn and what looked like little bite marks on the hair, but in pretty good condition regardless. I was a little creeped out. Decided to grab that toy and leave. It felt like a parting gift. So, this is gonna be a long one. We were out in the woods, group of 6 between 20 and 26 yo. The one who brought us there wanted to prove that this forest contains very bad/evil energy and we were like, "Yeah, sure, show us." So we went into the forest. All holding hands, walking in pairs and holding the t-shirt of the pair who walked in front of us. So we walked for like 15 minutes into the forest and basically nothing happened. We were walking past some fallen trees, a barrier on a dirt road that lead through the forest, nothing special at all. We reached our destination, a clearing in the woods. The clearance was kinda strange, because the trees had grown a real circle around the clearing. I asked, "What do we do now?" And the one who brought us there said, "We wait, and then we will go. You will know when." For like 5 minutes didn't happen anything whatsoever. And then started the most creepy experience of my whole life. My best friend leaned on a tree in the middle of the clearing, smoking a cigarette. He got up, we both looked the other way to the rest of our group. We turned back and the tree was gone. Only thing left was a hole, the tree just disappeared. But that was not the only thing, the whole effing clearing started to disappear. All of us had the feeling that the circle of the trees was coming closer and closer, inch by inch. 2 of us were completely freaking out and I have to admit, I was scared as well. I still thought of it like an illusion. But we decided, it was time to go, same tactic as before, 2 in front, 2 in middle, 2 at the end. I was at the end, right place, my best friend on left place. So we left. At least we tried. Because the entrance, where we got on the clearing, wasn't there. It disappeared as well. So we just tried to guess where we came from, and tried to leave there. We got out of the clearing, some meters from where we entered. But then the real horror started. We got out on the dirt road, where the barrier was. I looked in its direction and tried to use it as an point for navigation. But it was not there. All that was there was an old, molding, rotten tree trunk. My best friend had the same idea, so he saw the same. We looked around, didn't see anything familiar and just started walking. We all knew we had to get out ASAP. We took like 5 steps, I looked back and the barrier was back there. No tree. I told my BF and we were absolutely terrified, but our biggest problem was getting out of this forest. Because the whole effing forest simply changed its complete environment. On our way in, green, beautiful deciduous trees. On our way out, dead evergreens without a single sign of life in them. We had absolutely no idea where we were, and nobody knew where we were going. We tried to use the moon as reference, but its position seemed to jump all over the place. The worst thing about all this forest thing, the forest was silent. You could hear a feather falling. Nothing. So we were trapped in this forest maze but kept going. And then I felt somebody stepping into my heel, so I slipped out of my shoe and I lost it. I first thought the person behind me didn't pay attention enough, but I was the one walking on the rear. Nobody was behind me. So I let go of the t-shirt of the person in front of me and reached out for my shoe, and like in an instant my blood went ice cold. I just felt freezing for 5 or so. I was still holding the hand of my BF who didn't let go of it, and waited for me to put my shoe back on. I put on my shoe, looked up and just said run. And we both ran for our dear life. It took us like 1 full minute of sprinting to get back to our group, although I definitely needed under 10s to put shoe back on. Eventually we found our way out of the forest. It took us almost 2 hours. Later, one of the two that freaked out told us, while I had my shoe issue, he saw something, like a white silhouette of a humanoid creature, standing in the woods and watching him. The other one teared up and said, "So you did see it as well?" And they both started to cry. It's still to this day that I tear up and get goosebumps all over my body when I remember this experience. I have never looked at forests the same way from that day on. And I probably never will. I once walked into my bedroom to go to bed, dark outside obviously, switched the light on, and as the doorway was on the opposite wall to the window I was left staring at a figure, now illuminated with the bedroom light. The window was closed, the figure on the outside appeared to be clinging to the outside wall, one hand reaching up, gripping the window frame to the left side, and the other hand's fingers gripping the windowsill about halfway across the width of the window, with the index finger extended, fingertip resting on the glass. The head was visible in the corner of the window, where a human head should be given the positions of the arms. Slightly tilted to the right, looking into the room, the head had no face, no eyes, no mouth, although there were slight depressions where the eyes would have been. It was difficult to see, but the skin, or morph suit, was very pale, almost white, with a bit of grayness. I stared at it for maybe 5 seconds, it tapped the window with the finger, and I bolted it out of my room and ran downstairs to my parents still at the dining table. I told them about it and asked my dad to look, so he went up to my room and just closed the curtains so I couldn't see it. I used that time to draw what I had seen. I was 15 at the time and loved sketching, so made as good a representation as I could have at the time. The sketch is probably still around somewhere at my parents' place. I still swear what I saw was real, almost 10 years later. Still laugh at 15 years / me insisting on sleeping on the sofa that night. I live in a house that is, at least, a century home. We have much of the history of the home, to include the various residents and their causes of death. One of the former inhabitants was a family of 4, daughter died at 6, in the home, son died at 10, in the home, and the mother threw herself down the staircase. We've had several people notice a feeling of someone else here. Our cats diligently guard 2 specific areas of the house, and the front staircase, mother's choice for death, are often bypassed for the back staircase. A few years ago, at the start of winter, my husband and I both began to feel that something wasn't right. We couldn't put our finger on it. I sent a text to my best friend at 6 p.m. from our bedroom on the 3rd floor. I then woke up to someone shaking me at 1:09 a.m. I was curled up on the 1st floor, in the fetal position, with my phone grasped in my hand. I distinctly remember rolling over. I just needed to sleep a few more minutes, then I'd get up. The shaking was so intense that my glasses came off my face and I crawled to find them, on the other side of the room. What happened next will forever make my question all we think we know. As I reached my glasses, a woman shouted at me to stand up and open the window. Loudly. Loud enough and with enough force that I was shocked awake. I opted for the closest window and could not open it. I realized that I was trying to open it with one hand. I looked at the other and saw my phone was ringing. It was my best friend's face on the screen. I answered to hear her and emergency services telling me to go outside. I roused my husband and we made it to the front porch as emergency vehicles were arriving. Our house had a gas leak. There was no one in the house except my husband and I. My best friend received a call from my number, a woman saying there was another gas leak in the neighborhood and to hurry. The aforementioned child residents of the home died due to a gas leak from the lamps in the home. The mother threw herself down the stairs 2 days later. I was working late at night by myself in a small machine shop. Yes, I know, OSHA whatever. The machine was running and I was at the computer next to it working on a program when I felt as if someone was standing behind me. I turned around and experienced the most bizarre and terrifying feeling that I cannot fully explain. It felt like I turned around right up against a solid stone wall. The noise from the machine was muffled. My own breath bounced off something and back to me when I blew out and my eyes were trying to focus right in front of me for a split second and then nothing. The noise came back and I was staring at 50 feet of empty shop floor like there was just something there. I'm a grown man, I'm not afraid to say that I screamed. I felt terror like I've never felt before in my entire life. The closest thing I can think of is if you turned around and you were face to face with a ducking bear and it just walked away. My mom passed away in October of last year from COVID. Every now and then I'd go into her car to talk out loud in hopes that she could hear me somehow. I'd tell her about my day, stuff like that. It helped me cope. I'd listen to music on her radio sometimes. One day I went in there for a breakdown to just cry and put on the radio. The song that's playing, So Sick by Neo, was one of her favorites. I started crying harder. Song ends and the next song to play is Make Me Wanna by Usher. She loved Usher. At this point I'm thinking she's gotta be with me or trying to let me know something and I'm in a full-on breakdown, a complete mess. Here's where what happened still sticks with me as really weird and just what the hell. My mom's name was Dawn. Me and her would have conversations sometimes and joke about how her name was a popular soap, Dawn dish soap. The Usher song ends, some random song plays and I'm thinking in my head, please tell me something, Mom. Give me anything, and as that song ends, I shit you not, a Dawn dish soap commercial comes on the radio. I freaked the duck out. Like not in a good way, but like actual panic and fear that something like that just happened. I came in the house and broke down even more to my dad about what happened. I remember I just kept trying to wrap my head around why a radio station dedicated to old school R&B hits had an ad about Dawn dish soap of all things. Wasn't concert tickets, or the host just talking. But Dawn dish soap. Just really creepy to me how it all happened like that. I used to have sleep paralysis episodes for a few years when I was like 17 to 20. When reading into it I learned many people experience hallucinations and terrors while having an episode of paralysis due to the dream part of the brain not shutting off right away or something. This had never happened to me and my episodes just consisted of paralysis with the heavy weight feeling on my chest for about 5 minutes before I came to, but I was aware of the possibility of dreams when having an episode. One night I wake very suddenly, like no grogginess, just bam wide awake. It's dark in my room but not pitch black from the moonlight coming through the curtains. So I wake up and immediately there's a face hovering right above mine. Maybe a foot away, really close but not touching noses close. I remember what I had read about sleep paralysis, so I'm not freaked out at all, I'm just kinda staring at this figure waiting for my brain to fully wake up. Note that I wasn't having an episode, I was able to move. While I'm staring I notice how clear the face is. Even though the figure was completely black I was able to make out features like its nose and cheekbones, chin, etc. It seemed like it was darker than the rest of the room. The figure was pitch black while the room was just dark. So I'm laying there for a while cause I'm thinking my brain is being weird, but this is kind of neat, so I'm just analyzing it. About 10 minutes has gone by and I'm thinking to myself, I really think I'm awake by now. What the hell is this thing? Is this actually a thing? I should note I didn't feel threatened at all the whole time, like it was just watching me but not maliciously, but not necessarily in a good way either. At this point, even though I wasn't really getting bad vibes, I'm starting to get a little freaked out because the clarity of the figure, and the fact that I've been able to watch it for a solid 10 minutes and it's still there, just looking back at me. So I start to sit up and it mirrors my movement, pulling its head back as I rise, keeping roughly the same distance. I can see its body now and it's fairly big, but pretty thin, hunched over on the floor at the foot of my bed, probably about 10 feet tall if it had been standing. After sitting up I decide to keep watching it for a while before I move again, so we just watch each other for another 5 minutes. Slowly getting more freaked out, I figure it's time to turn off the lights, so I slowly take my covers off and step out of bed off to the right for the light switch, keeping my eyes on the figure as I go. His head follows me while I make the journey to the door, and I stare at him again one last time before hitting the lights, kinda shaking my head and rubbing my eyes to snap myself to my senses to see if that helps. He's still there, and starts kind of leaning back a bit. I flip on the lights and he instantly vanishes. Never saw him again, or had any similar experiences. Really strange, mostly because of how long it lasted. If I was still dreaming of whatever, I think it would have gone away. I had trouble sleeping for a few nights even though I didn't think he meant any harm. I switched places with myself in the timeline. In sophomore year of high school, I got knocked out at school. It was fine, doesn't matter. While I was unconscious, I dreamt that I was a sophomore in college, laying out on a grassy campus green in the sun with a new friend. It was hyper-realistic. I could hear the sounds, smell the scents, feel the sun, etc. I was there. I was so relieved that I wasn't in my small town anymore and I was in college. I remember thinking, OMG, I am so glad that is all over. I fell asleep on my towel. When I woke up back in high school, I was very confused. I was just at college. Where was I? I thought it was winter, but it was actually late spring, almost summer. I didn't know how old I was or what happened, but if I could describe to you the inner screaming I did when I realized it was a dream. Like horror movies don't come close. I was deeply depressed for like a year after that. Fast forward to sophomore year of college. Obviously I'd forgotten all about the incident in high school. It's the beginning of the semester, so the weather is still warm. A person I knew casually in the dorm invited me to go lay out on the lawn with her. I was like, hey, yeah, I can do that. I felt so relaxed. I didn't have any more classes that day and I could just chill. No homework yet because the semester just started. The sun was warm, everyone was happy. I fell asleep on my towel. And I was back in high school again. I went through the same incident, in hyper-realistic view. When the inner scream started, I startled myself awake and I was back at college. I've never had another dreaming experience like that, only those 2 times, so I don't know how to explain it. I have had a few paranormal experiences in my life, but this one was by far the creepiest. I was walking home one night from my volunteer work at the theater. A walk I'd made at night many times. Near my house there is this park where there's a large field with a few copses of trees. As I came down the road by the church, I rounded a corner and happened to glance towards the trees. I saw a figure stood amongst them. Very tall. I'm 6 feet and this was definitely taller than me. It was draped all in black. Black hood. This was weird as in England it is extremely out of place. I looked at it for a good 10 seconds or so and then I glanced ahead, I was still walking, and glanced back and it was completely gone. The copse it was in was only about 5 or so trees and I had heard no movement. I picked up the pace and even crossed the road. I kept looking behind me but I never saw whatever it was again. That creeped me out. One other time was during the middle of the day. My grandmother and I were driving over the hills to a town for the day, again, a drive we had made many times before. I was in the back and I looked up at the hills and I saw a person in the distance stand up from a kneeling position. The only thing was to be that far away and that tall. This thing had to have been about 20 feet tall. Not even joking. I blurted out, "What in the duck is that?" And my mum saw it too. "Statue?" she said. "I saw it move," I said. "It was knelt down." My mum was convinced it was a statue until we went home the same way and it wasn't there again. There were some old fire trucks in the field up there, like antique ones, and these looked like Tonka toys compared to the size of whatever the hell that was. While it wasn't as immediately scary as the first encounter, that was certainly the weirdest thing I think I've ever seen in my entire life. And it was seen by someone else. Looking back, it was incredibly eerie. I have not the foggiest semblance of an idea as to what it could have been. About 10 years ago I was a boot in a sniper platoon out of 2D Martiv. I had terrible sleep hygiene naturally coupled with barracks alcoholism and a pack-a-day smoking habit. All of these things contributed to my horrible sleep paralysis/shadow people visits. I had these so frequently I was no longer scared of them and could just power through. This story was the strangest thing that happened to me during one of the aforementioned phenomena. We had been in the field for about 4 days in and out of hides with very little sleep and extended movements throughout. I had pulled the balls to 4 radio watch after moving about 8 clicks through the night. I was exhausted and could barely stay awake. Anyways, I was leaning against a tree bobbing for apples when I heard a voice call out my name like it was my buddy Tyler. "Dude, come over here," it said. He was my team lead, so I did as told. I walked over to where he had flopped to pass out and he was dead asleep. I just figured he might have been talking in his sleep and carried on back to watch. This time I heard something rustling in the bushes, and if you know Camp Lejeune you know it's a ducking swamp with all kinds of mean shit in it, so I thought, oh duck, a bear. Problem was, in Tyler's voice it said, "Dude, you gotta come look at this shit. I want you all to understand I'm a doc," so naturally, I was like, oh duck this and shine my white light on it. Where my light touched I could make a figure out about 8 feet tall, but in the strangest way I couldn't make myself understand what the duck it was. It just stood there, hunched, not moving, not breathing, but standing on 2 feet. It was like a shadow but it wasn't. Its eyes had no color, not even black, but I could tell they were there watching me. I remember I didn't feel fear, but confusion and an incredibly powerful urge to walk towards this figure. I remember taking a couple steps towards it and the closer I got the safer I felt. All the while, it still just stared at me, not making a sound. "Doc, what the duck are you doing, dipshit?" the real Tyler said. I turned to where he was sleeping and my team lead was understandably pissed off that I was basically white lighting the whole tree line and stomping around like a duck. I turned back to where I last saw the creature, but it was gone. To this day I rationalize this event as me falling asleep standing up and having one of my shadow people moments. I was 19, driving around town with a friend sometime after midnight, talking shit and listening to music. We drive past this road with a signpost to an area neither of us heard of despite both of us living in town our whole lives. I asked if she wanted to see where the road went, she said yes, so I pull a U-turn and off we go. It's a paved road, heavy trees on each side and a few houses. Nothing unusual for either of us, I was living on a street like that at the time. Anyway, within about 5 minutes, the conversation just kind of dies off. And a few minutes after that, I start to get an uneasy feeling. Then we passed a kangaroo on the side of the road. It remained perfectly still, just turning its head to watch us drive past, and I got the distinct impression it was standing guard. After that, I just got more and more anxious. I ended up turning to my friend and saying, "This is going to sound stupid, but can you?" She was already taking her seatbelt off. "I'll lock the back doors." We kept following the road even after that because we're stubborn witches and don't know when to admit defeat. It was at least half an hour, because my 60-minute cassette tape had flipped over twice, between pulling onto the paved road and coming to a sign saying dirt road ahead. By this stage I felt physically sick and my skin was crawling. Without a word, I did the quickest 3-point turn I was able to do and we headed back down the road. The closer we got back to the turn off, the better I felt until we were back on the main road where I felt like I could breathe easily again. We told a few people about it, got brushed off mostly. We didn't even drive past that turn off without flinching or shuddering for a few months, the feeling of dread had been that strong. Then about 6 months later, she turns to me out of nowhere and said, "Let's drive it during the day." So we went. My friend has both her phone and mine on her lap with emergency numbers punched in. We're playing upbeat pop music to try and keep us calm. It took us less than 5 minutes to reach the dirt road, and on checking the odometer, the paved section was only 1 kilometer long. Once again, we got the duck out of there. Have never been back. No idea what the hell was going on that night, but I can say with certainty that we were not meant to be there. Even 20 years later, if someone mentions the area on the signpost, we shudder, and recently I turned to her out of nowhere and said, "Hey, was that you with me on the road where?" "Yes. And I don't want to talk about it." This is a story that still kind of creeps me out when I tell it. My dad maintained a garden when I was a kid. We used to eat cherry tomatoes with sweet peppers, catch fireflies, sit on the swing, good times. One summer, I think pre-high school, my sister and mom had gone out in the evening. It was one of those dark gray evenings with strong wind and a slight freezing drizzle. My dad was working in the garden, probably setting up something because there's not much to do there when it's raining. I was just sitting inside and eating ice cream. Suddenly I see a shadow at the door. No knocks or warning. It's my dad. He's just there, still, breath fogging the glass door. Immediately I get up and open the door for him. He stumbles in, an entirely bewildered look on his face. To put it plainly, he looked quite disheveled, even in comparison to the fact that he was working manual labor in the rain. After a moment, he says in the most collected voice, "Introverted void, if you could get me some water." He's my dad, so I immediately duck into the kitchen and get the water. I come back and he's still in the one spot, dead-eyed, hunched over. Keep in mind my dad was normally a very clean-cut guy, always clean-shaven and well-groomed, standing straight with a dignified posture. I give him the glass and he drinks it like a shot, biting the glass. My dad then stumbles right back out, but before he leaves, he tells me something that I can barely muster. "Don't close the door." "Okay, sure." He goes back to his plants and I go back to channel surfing. But the sound and thought of the rain coming in, with the growling thunder, I decide to close it anyway. The rain was getting harder and I ended up soaking my socks in the process. Then, I hear an urgent knock. I check, nobody is there. I hear a few raps on the door. It's my dad, again. He looks normal as ever. I let him in and he asks why there's so much water on the floor. I tell him everything. Sure enough, he denies ever coming back in. No way in hell would he ever ask me to open the door while it's raining, either. The only proof I ever had of this interaction was the foggy scraped glass I had on the table. To this day, neither of us have any memory problems. Apparently something similar had happened to him when I was very little. I told him that I threw up late at night, he went to my room, and he found me asleep. It happened again an hour later. Ducking wild. The experiences refine my love for horror now, lol, so it's all good. I used to be a manager at a retail store and we had a few weird things happen there. One day I found a bunch of broken glass shelves that all the employees said they knew nothing about. I checked the camera footage and there was no one in the room. Lights were off. All of a sudden the motion sensor lights came on, then a few seconds later all the glass broke. Once I had to work overnight with 2 other employees. There was music playing over the speakers, but at some point in the night the music stopped and all of us heard a baby crying over the speakers. I told another one of our managers about the crying baby, but he didn't believe it. He said there is always some explanation for things like that. Until one night he was there late at night and heard the same thing. Said he locked up and ran out of the store. I was still living with my parents, up late one night watching TV. Our dog was with me laying in my lap. There were no lights on in the house, just the glow of the TV. Around 3 to 3:30 a.m., I saw someone walking down the stairs out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look and see who it was, expecting one of my parents to tell me to turn off the TV and go to bed. As I turned my head towards the stairs, I saw the shadow of a person coming down the stairs. Nobody was there. I wanted to tell myself it was just a shadow from the light of the TV screen, but my dog had woken up and looked at the same exact spot. She looked up at me after we stared in the darkness at seemingly nothing, and the look of fear on my dog's face made my blood run cold. It wasn't the only instance in that house. My older sister was a huge science nerd. She's a middle school science teacher now, and she had glued those glow-in-the-dark stars and planets all over her ceiling. There was a period of time where she'd turn off the lights to go to bed and things would block out the flow in the dark stars above her bed as she looked up, as if something was standing over her and moving around the room. There were nights where she'd wake up the whole house screaming from it. I'd hear noises in my room. Sometimes it was a long, drawn-out hiss that sounded like it was coming from right over my shoulder, and other times I'd hear things moving in my closet. I tried to justify the hissing as the sound of cars driving by outside, but we lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and the sound would carry on much longer than a car simply passing by. One day I was going through my closet and there was a massive cane toad in my closet. My room was on the 2nd floor of my house. There was no logical explanation as to how it got there. Years after my siblings and I had moved out, my parents had decided to get a divorce. My dad had moved out and got an apartment across town. Late one night my mom was coming home from work. As she was rounding the corner to get to the front door, she saw a tall, dark silhouette standing in front of the patio door. She said it had no defined features, but it was close to 7 feet tall. She asked my dad to come over the next day and put in a bright motion sensor light right outside the patio door. That house always gave me the creeps. About 10 years ago, I went on a solo backpacking trip in Vietnam. On my first night I took an overnight sleeper train to travel north. I was assigned to the top left bed in a 4-bed cabin. The bottom 2 beds were taken by 2 kind-looking local ladies, probably in their 50s, the other top bed was unoccupied. Save for some gestured pleasantries, the local ladies and I didn't interact much. I didn't speak Vietnamese, and they didn't speak English. At around 1 a.m., I woke with a start as I felt a hand grab my left shoulder roughly, and started dragging me towards the edge of my bed. The next sequence of events still haunts/puzzles me to this day. As I was being dragged against my will, I turned and saw the hand coming from an outstretched, unnaturally elongated arm of one of the local ladies who had the bed diagonally below mine. She was staring at me, with a deeply sinister grin. We locked gaze for what felt like eternity and her grin widened, all while dragging me closer to her. I remember asking myself, is this a dream? But everything looked and felt very real, the crispness of what I'm seeing, the monotonous chugging of the train, the details of the cabin, the window, lamps, cracks in the ceiling, nothing was dreamlike at all, other than the elongated arm. I was freaking out and thought, this is how I die. At this point, my shoulder and head have already been dragged out of the bed. I looked up at the ceiling of the cabin and desperately muttered a Buddhist chant. I grew up in a Buddhist household, while closing my eyes so tight they were hurting. How long I stayed like this for, I was so scared of opening my eyes. When I eventually did, everything was back to normal. I was positioned in the middle of the bed, and there was no hand grabbing me. When I mustered enough courage to turn and check on the lady, she was fast asleep. I crept out of bed gingerly, got out of the cabin and chain-smoked until I managed to calm my nerves. The rest of the night was uneventful, thank heavens, and the next morning the 2 ladies disembarked before I did. Could I have imagined everything? Possibly. It's a terrible, terrible memory that has no answers and I probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I was a janitor at a care home, smallish place under 50 residents when I worked there. Anyways, only had one thing happen while I was there, but that was enough. I was cleaning the basement floors. It was just a long dark hallway, It sounds fake as hell because it's so stereotypical, with storage closets off on one side and a staff bathroom about halfway down the hall. So I'm mopping away and get the hallway done, and go to clean the staff bathrooms. Men's bathroom is fine. I knock and announce myself to enter the women's washroom and no one answers, so I open up and start cleaning. Well, I left the washroom to go into the hallway and get a roll of bags to change the garbage out, and when I open the door to go back inside, a woman is just standing at the far end of the bathroom by the stalls. There is no possible way for her to be in there, and I don't immediately recognize her, and she didn't make any sounds, so I did what any healthy early 20-year-old guy would do, and I booked it the duck out of the basement. I went to the front desk and told them about it. No one had seen anything down there before and none of the residents were missing. I really did not like cleaning down there again after that, and honestly barely did. I've had a vivid memory of seeing a demon-like figure above my bed when I was a small child. I vaguely remember it smiling at me. I also remember hiding in the closet from something. There was another time when I was in HS, 16 or 17, and I was staying at my dad's house. He was out of town, and my sister and I shared a room at the time. I was sound asleep, and I remember my feeling someone get in the bed with me. It wasn't uncommon for my younger sister to do this if she was scared for whatever reason, so I moved over a little so she could get in. I was laying on my side with my back to her. I laid there for probably 10 seconds or so before a sudden realization came to me. My sister was at my mom's house and I was in the house alone. I was frozen for a moment, but then sprang out of bed and ran straight downstairs, grabbed my keys, and got in the car. I immediately left and called my mom, who lived a few miles away. I told her what happened and that I was going to come stay there that evening. I was at my grandparents' place in rural Midwestern US, and took their dog Molly for a walk in the woods like I usually did when visiting. The woods were fairly deep, but you were never more than half a mile away from the neighborhood at any given point. I came to my favorite rest spot in the woods, and there was one trail on it that I rarely took since it wasn't long, and went into someone's backyard. Knowing I had to be back before dinner, I decided to take that trail since it was only about 10 minutes round trip. I knew that at some point there was a pile of rubble from a long demolished house, and stayed on the lookout for that since it meant that I was close to someone's property and had to turn around. I'm walking around for a good 20 minutes enjoying the sights before Molly stops and refuses to move. This was unusual, since she usually was running from side to side sniffing stuff, but she was fixated on something down the trail that I couldn't see. Being stopped there, I realized that this part of the woods was unusually empty. Usually I'd have heard an animal, seen a piece of trash, felt some wind, or heard the cars on the road not too far from where I thought I was. I couldn't see much of anything except for the woods and the woods alone, which started to feel claustrophobic. The trail looked like it was a straight line infinitely going in either direction. Molly's still glaring at something way down the trail, and I'm looking up, down and all around trying to figure out what it is, but there's literally nothing except for us and the trees, not even random plants. I decide to turn around since Molly started growling, her hair was sticking up, and she stood back. This was alarming since Molly was a very old dog, 13 or 14 in human years, and never barked or made much noise other than the dog equivalent of purring. We're walking back down the trail, and I hear sticks breaking behind me. Keep in mind that there were no sticks on the ground in the area. They start getting faster, which makes Molly run away with the leash, so I chase after her all the way home, not looking back. I did some research after the fact, and there were no lethal animals in that part of town except for bears, but one hadn't been spotted in over 20 years. I've been on that trail a few more times since then to try and figure out what exactly happened, but every time I went down it I ran into the rubble and never found that straight path that went on forever. When I was a teenager and still lived with my mom, our house was on the very outskirts of a small town. From our front porch, making a left down the road took me out into the woods, where before long the road turned to gravel. I liked to take walks out this way, and sometimes my walks would be pretty long. One day, in the middle of summer when the days were long, I went out walking around 12 to 1 p.m. or so. Shortly after the road turns to gravel, there are some railroad tracks that intersect the road and go way out into the woods. I knew that these tracks were out of use. I'd lived here most of my life and had never once heard or seen a train. I was feeling adventurous and set off down the tracks. And I just kept walking. I never really felt like turning back. I just wanted to keep following the tracks and see where they led. The entire trip I was mostly surrounded by trees, with the occasional glimpse of a farmhouse and surrounding fields. I walked for many, many hours until the sun was going down. It must have been around 8 p.m. or so, but I didn't have a phone back then and didn't know the time for sure. Right at sunset, I came across a small town with a population in the double digits. I had no idea this town was even here. I decided to sit and rest for a while, then head back. A few people walked up and made some small talk. They seemed a bit shocked at how far I'd walked when I told them where I was from. After they went on their way and I finished resting, I got up and started back home in the dark. The trip home was no faster than the trip there. I was tired, hungry, and thirsty at this point. I had brought nothing to eat or drink. I hadn't originally intended to be gone for more than a half hour to an hour or so, and hadn't told anyone where I was going. After walking for a few hours, I was in the middle of absolutely nowhere, surrounded by trees, several miles both from home and from the small town I had discovered. Although rare, there was an occasional gravel road cutting through the tracks. At one point, while totally lost in my thoughts, it suddenly occurred to me that there was a small, faint light on the tracks in front of me. It started getting bigger and brighter rapidly. I suddenly realized, train. And sprinted off the tracks to my right, down into a ditch with heavy growth at the bottom, thick bushes and such. I jumped off those tracks so fast that I tripped and scuffed myself up a bit, but I brushed myself off and was fine. But I realized there was no train. I felt a mixture of confusion and fear as I crouched down in the bushes and backed into the trees. I looked up the tracks from the way I came, trying to see what was causing the light. I couldn't see the source, but the light was scanning the trees. It was obviously a flashlight, and someone was looking for me. After a minute or two, while the lights were scanning the tree line on the other side, I managed to carefully peek out of the bushes and get a look at where it was coming from. A man was standing on the tracks, a few hundred feet away. I couldn't see much aside from his silhouette though. I backed way up into the woods as quietly as I could and waited on him to leave. He walked up the tracks close to where I was, looked for me for a while, then finally gave up and left. I waited a while, long enough to be sure he was gone, then slowly crept back out of the woods. When I realized he was gone, I started down the tracks again, now constantly checking for him over my shoulder. I kept running over possible scenarios of who it could be. Maybe one of the people I spoke to at that town? Maybe one of their friends? Nobody else even knew I was out here. How did this guy know where I was anyways? How did he catch me? The thing is, if he knew I was out here, he knew I was following the tracks and he knew which way I was going. Would he be waiting for me at the next road crossing? It seemed almost guaranteed. Should I ditch the tracks and take off into the woods? I don't even know how I would get home if I did. I decided to keep following the tracks, but to be very cautious of roads and scope crossings out first. After a couple of hours, I came across the next road. I stopped and listened for any cars before approaching. Didn't hear anything. I looked up and down the road both ways. No sign of any cars in either direction. No noise at all. No lights, nothing. So I crossed. Just maybe 20 to 30 seconds after I finished crossing, I heard a car engine pull up on the road behind me and stop. I ran into the woods and laid flat on the ground. Sure enough, the guy was waiting on me. He came out the same as before, scanning all up and down the tree line with his flashlight. Walking up and down the tracks. This time though, I noticed something I missed the first time. He had a gun. My heart rate immediately shot up to 1,000,000 beats a minute, even more than it already was. He didn't speak a word, didn't call out to me, nothing. He for sure knew I was there though, he had too. The first time I'd seen him was a couple hours back. It wasn't coincidence that he pulled up when he did, he must have seen me. Regardless, he couldn't find me. He eventually gave up and got back in his car and took off again. I gave it a good amount of time before I got back up. This time I took off jogging. Fortunately I was a cross-country runner, but I still had many, many miles in front of me. I was running for a long time before I realized I should save my stamina in case I really need it, so I started walking again. I still was checking over my shoulder. I alternated between jogging and walking. I was constantly thinking about hiding places, and ready to duck back into the woods at a moment's notice. The trip back home took hours. When I made it to my street, and off the tracks, I avoided every car. Whenever I heard a car coming, I would dive back into the woods. I finally made it home at 3 a.m., but was worried the guy might have seen where I lived or something. Coming home woke Mom up, and she came into the kitchen to yell at me. She seemed unfazed by my story about the guy, she was too mad to listen. The next day, she told me someone was here to talk to me. I went to the front door and it was a cop. Apparently the people I spoke with at the other town had assumed I was suicidal and trying to get hit by a train because I was wearing black. This was literally the reason they told the cops. I said nothing to indicate I was suicidal, and the tracks weren't even in use. Anyways, the point is this cop was the guy looking for me. It seems crazy that he would literally just run around looking for someone on the tracks in the middle of the night. He just told me that walking on the tracks is illegal and not to do it again. Spending the night by myself on my dad's sailboat. Usually didn't do this, but he and my brother decided to go with a friend to a boat race. There was almost no wind, a long course, and in regattas you forfeit if you run your engine at all. So they were gone 30 hours, leaving me in this tiny town in what was essentially a large, narrow RV that floated. I was reading a book around 12:30 a.m. as I couldn't sleep. Very quiet night since most boaters were gone and there was very little wind. Then I heard a child ask, "Permission to come aboard?" You can't knock on boats like you can houses or vehicles, so established protocol is that that's what you say if you don't know the sailor well. Friends will tend to yell down, "Hey, you," or similar, or announce themselves as they walk down the stub of dock that is like a driveway shared between two boats. There were very few people overall, no small kids in the marina, and any older child that was strong enough to steer and help had been bribed/coerced into helping with the race. There should not have been a child. But I didn't answer. Went up the ladder to see if someone needed help, grabbed a kayak paddle from the deck in case I needed to help fish someone out of the harbor, saw two small kids with dark eyes. I didn't look directly at them because I'm a bit autistic and I don't normally, and I was getting creepy vibes. A friend also told me the superstition that you never, ever, answer the door for a stranger at night because it's death knocking. I just had really bad vibes, and they asked again. Exact same wording. Some part of me wanted to let them on, but I read enough and had my friend's superstition to bank on. Yelled, "No. Go away," while brandishing the large double-ended paddle at them. They walked off, seeming to vanish really fast in the dark. I prayed, raided the onboard liquor cabinet, and forced the dog to sleep on top of me that night.